Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast. Good morning. It's Tuesday, the 25th of November. I'm Caroline Hepker in London. Coming up today, missiles and drones bombard Kyiv as Ukraine strikes southern Russia following talk of big progress on a peace deal. President Trump holds back-to-back calls with the leaders of China and Japan as tensions flare. Plus, food for thought, why Pret A Manger's revival recipe hinges on a meal deal and £13 salads. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories. Russia and Ukraine exchanged heavy fire this morning as both sides confronted strikes. Ukraine's air defences worked to protect the capital, Kyiv, from heavy bombardment, while a region on Russia's Black Sea coast also reportedly came under sustained drone attack. The surge in hostilities comes just hours after President Donald Trump struck a positive tone on the proposals and prospects for a ceasefire, saying in a social media post that big progress was being made. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Zelensky says that a proposed US plan has correct points, but sensitive issues still need to be discussed directly with Trump.
Of course, we all continue working with partners, especially the United States, and look for compromises that strengthen but not weaken us.
President Zelensky spoke as Ukrainian and European officials scrambled to draft a counter-offer in the days since the White House Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and his Russian counterpart Kirill Dmitriev hammered out an initial 28-point peace plan. Bloomberg understands that the result is now a streamlined 19-point plan, which Russian officials have already dismissed as a non-starter. The European Union has rejected a US demand to ease tech regulation in return for lower steel tariffs. In a statement on Monday, the EU's antitrust chief, Teresa Ribera, said the bloc's digital rulebook is, quote, not up for negotiation. That's after US Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick told Bloomberg his administration could relax levies in return for the rollback.
So we're talking to him about take your foot off the regulatory statement, build those data centers in America, and in exchange for that, we'll come up with a cool steel and aluminum deal that will all be together.
Howard Lutnick speaking there. The news follows President Trump's characterization of EU digital regulation as the sort of so-called trade barrier that his tariffs are intended to target. Currently, the US imposes a 50% levy on European imports of metals. Despite Trump's threat, the EU says that the rules are to ensure fair markets and to protect consumers' rights. And they have pressed ahead with enforcement, including recent fines against Apple and Meta. Well, President Trump has held back-to-back calls with the leaders of China and Japan as tensions rise over Taiwan. According to Chinese state media, China's Xi Jinping told President Trump the island's return to China is an essential part of the post-World War II international order. Following that conversation, Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi said the US president updated her on his talks, reaffirming US-Japanese ties. Adam Farah is senior geoeconomics analyst for Asia-Pacific at Bloomberg Economics. He says the outlook remains uncertain.
But the real risk here is that this escalates further. Japan relies on China as a principal trading partner, and more importantly, significantly on China's rare earths and critical minerals, which could devastate the advanced technology industry and auto industry if they were to be pulled back. But so far, right now, we're not seeing the signs that China is looking to escalate that far right now.
Bloomberg Economics' Adam Farah speaking there. The ongoing row between Japan and China over Taiwan is injecting fresh uncertainty into the Trump-Xi relationship, just weeks after leaders of the world's largest economies reached a trade truce. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said earlier this month that a rare earths deal between the two countries was hopefully going to be completed by Thanksgiving, though talks on key implementation details continue. Now, Meta is reportedly in talks to spend billions of dollars on Google's AI chips in a sign that Nvidia's semiconductor dominance may be challenged. Shares in Nvidia fell in late trading after the story was reported by the tech outlet The Information. Bloomberg's tech analyst Robert Lee says competition is almost inevitable for Nvidia.
Nvidia, simply put, is a monopoly at the moment, more by accident than design. It had an approximate 10-year technological lead. It's been investing for far longer than anybody else, and therefore it's got the market to itself at the moment. It's been generating, I think, what economists would term supernormal profits. They're not sustainable at that level in the long term. So that's clearly going to attract competition, alternative suppliers.
Robert Lee speaking there. The challenge to Nvidia, the world's largest company, comes as it also faces pushback in the investment world. Nvidia has been sending memos to Wall Street analysts after famous investor Michael Burry accused the company of diluting its stock. To the UK now. Chancellor Rachel Reeves will cut the amount that Britons can save tax-free in a bid to get more people investing in stocks. Bloomberg has learnt that the £20,000 annual limit on cash individual savings accounts, known as ISAs, will be cut to £12,000 at tomorrow's budget. Reeves is expected to announce multiple tax rises at the fiscal event, something the head of Britain's Confederation of British Industry, Ray Newton-Smith, has railed against.
So if growth is your priority, make hard choices for it. Prove it. Against opposition, against short-term politics, be it on welfare, be it pension increases, show the markets you mean business. All short-term politics leads to is long-term decline, and this country cannot afford another decade of stagnation.
Ray Newton-Smith's comments are a sign of the deep misgivings from the business community ahead of the budget. At the same event, the business secretary, Peter Carl, apologised for the uncertainty caused by the speculation around tax hikes in the budget. Those are our top stories for you today. In markets, global stocks are gaining. We see the MSCI Asia Pacific Index at the moment up by 0.4%. Yesterday in the US, Nvidia's stock slipped 1.5%. Alphabet's rose by 2.6%. US and European stock futures are both in the red this morning. Also, I note that European defence stocks have been struggling, been one of the big gainers over the course of this year. But a Goldman Sachs basket of the top defence stocks in Europe is now down about 25% from the early October peak. Meanwhile, the Fed's Christopher Waller says that he's advocating an interest rate cut in December, so that view seems to be piling up. In terms of 10-year Treasury yields, we're at 4.03, yields up a basis point. Gold, typically benefiting from lower rates, of course, is up by 0.3% this morning at $4,151. Those are the markets. Now, in a moment, we're going to bring you more on the latest to push Ukraine and Russia towards some kind of ceasefire deal, as well as why Pret A Manger is looking at £13 salads to drive its revival. But before we get to that, there's always a story that catches my eye. And actually, it's still on the food theme. Maybe there's always a food theme at this time in the morning for me. It's going to a restaurant about eating, or is it about the spectacle? Bloomberg's food critic, Kate Crader, says that she knew that people dining out wanted a memorable experience, but actually she didn't realise how much of a full-on obsession the spectacle has really become until she visited 11 Madison Park in New York. She says it started with a potato, and then Kate goes on to describe what the restaurant did to the humble spud: crosswire sliced, smoke infused, dusted and displayed. She says it was just a showstopper. The issue is the potato was not fully cooked. And she actually gave 11 Madison Park not great marks for the food, but she said that the spectacle did blow her away. And of course, anyone who knows the restaurant industry knows that 11 Madison Park, EMP, often has won 3 Michelin stars. It was voted the world's best restaurant in 2017. So it's kind of really up there. But she also says that there are lots of other restaurants now that are emulating this. You know, servers who feel like friends, they entertain you. The Carbone Riviera, which is a new restaurant in Las Vegas, which has a speedboat to to take you around the lake outside. No wonder maybe food at restaurants is feeling a bit like an afterthought. So I quite fancy the speedboat dinner experience. Anyway, I'll put a link to it in our show notes for you. Now, an initial US-backed peace plan for Ukraine has been paired to 19 proposals, with European allies warning against a rush to end Russia's war. But Moscow has balked at the plan, and overnight Russia and Ukraine exchanged a lot of fire. Joining us now is Bloomberg's chief Europe correspondent, Oliver Crook, to talk about this. Ollie, good morning. There was vehement opposition to the Witkoff-Dmitriev 28-point plan by the Europeans. That has been reworked. Is there any way forwards, given Russia's rejection? What's the US going to do next?
Well, that's the big question about what the United States is going to do next. We can give you sort of the sequencing of what the last kind of 36 hours and the next few hours will look like. So obviously there were those long discussions in Geneva between the U.S. delegation and the Ukrainians. We understand the Europeans were sort of there on the side, weren't part of the principal discussions, but were sort of advising at the sidelines. There were apparently a couple of different kind of peace plans that were circulating after that. There was a European one. There was the one that the Ukrainians and the Americans had worked together, and we seem to have settled on this 19-point plan that is sort of considered the sort of living document, it seems, that is currently now being under review by the United States, and eventually will make its way back to Russia. And as you say, the Russians have been sort of very dismissive, sort of out of hand about that proposal as it stands. We heard from Zelensky last night in his nightly address. He's saying that after the Geneva talks, there is no longer the 28-point plan. There's the 19 one. Many of the right elements have been taken into account into that framework. But what that framework did do is kick down the road a number of the most contentious political issues for the President of the United States and President Zelensky to discuss between the two of them in person, ideally at some point, or on the phone. And I spoke to one of Zelensky's aides yesterday saying that that call could come over the next few days. Where the action now turns is in Abu Dhabi, where we understand that the Army Secretary Dan Driscoll, who is now playing a much larger role in these negotiations, we understand, according to reports, that he met with some Ukrainians in Abu Dhabi last night, that he will be meeting with some of the Russian officials a little bit later today to try to hammer out some of these differences. But again, all of that being said, this is still a very sort of actively debated document, living, as we say, and ever evolving. Though all of that being said, I think that the Thursday Thanksgiving timeline is probably a little bit ambitious in terms of actually getting all of this over the line.
Yes, absolutely. I know, and Dan Driscoll, interesting, an ally of J.D. Vance also. European leaders, though, they have pushed back against this 28-point plan, but they have got this kind of maximalist rhetoric with quite gradualist measures, some might argue. And so the question is also about the frozen Russian assets. Is anything changing on the European side?
Well, it sort of depends who you ask. I mean, they're going to hold a sort of coalition of the willing call today, which is obviously greater than just the Europeans. So that is going to be where the European discussion goes. That's about 50 countries. This will be assembled virtually. You know, it will be attended by Starmer, Macron, and all the sort of usual suspects in terms of trying to make forward progress on, other ways that they can support Ukraine, ways that they could lobby the United States. But you point out once again, and I feel like a broken record coming on every day and talking about this, but the one point where the Europeans can exert leverage, can make a massive difference to these negotiations, to the Ukrainians, is by figuring out what to do with the 140 billion euros worth of Russian assets that are sitting in Belgium, that there has been no consensus on among the EU 27 on how to get that sort of loan backed by those assets and get it to Ukraine. As we've said many, many times, this would change the dynamic fundamentally for the Ukrainians if they had 140 billion euros in the bank. I spoke to the Lithuanian foreign minister yesterday who said, listen, we need to be realistic here in Europe. In order to get a seat at this table in 2025 with Donald Trump, you need to earn your seat at that table. And the only way that we can earn our seat at the table is to move on those Russian assets. And that's what we should be doing today.
Okay, that's one view then on what the Europeans should be doing. What about the state of the conflict, though? Russia's economy is barely growing, given the war spending. Ukraine is struggling with manpower on the front line. The conflict is there and it's fierce.
Absolutely. And we see, overnight, over the last week, I mean, there's been a number of reports, especially the middle of last week, with a number of missiles hitting apartment buildings, killing many civilians. Overnight, Kyiv getting absolutely pummeled. The Ukrainians, in turn, returning fire into Russia that downed a great majority of those drones. But this is a war that is, of course, raging very, very violently, continues to be fought on the front lines for very sort of marginal gains on the Russian side, but they have been advancing throughout all this discussion. I think that the sort sort of big question here will be if the United States' position changes on what we have, which is this bill, this bipartisan bill that sits right now in the U.S. Senate about those bone-crushing sanctions that was put forward by Lindsey Graham. This is something that would pass in the United States. It has support from the Democrats and the Republicans. And a reminder, that is for sanctions on anybody buying Russian crude oil or gas from the United States, 500% tariffs. And we should say, Caroline, something that we sort of have missed with all of this sort of deluge of the news over the 28-point plan, that on Friday, last Friday, is when those Lukoil and Rosneft sanctions went into effect for the first time. Those are absolutely massive in terms of the damage they will do to the Russian economy. Of course, it is a long sort of term damage that it will do. It will not be tomorrow. But when I spoke to the U.S. envoy to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, he says that this is the thing that the Russians complain the most about. This is where it hurts them the most.
Interesting. Yeah. And also that President Trump and Xi, when they spoke on that phone call that we mentioned about Japan and China, they also did discuss, President Xi and President Trump, the Ukraine situation too. So, yeah, there's also that layer to add. Ollie, thank you so much for being with us. Bloomberg's chief Europe correspondent, Oliver Crook, with the latest when it comes to the path ahead for Ukraine. Stay with us. More from Bloomberg Daybreak Europe coming up after this. Now, £6 meal deals and 13 quid for a salad. Pret A Manger's chain of 500 UK stores are trying different approaches under CEO Pano Christou. Joining us now to discuss is Bloomberg's consumer reporter, Maddie Parker, for something a bit different. Maddie, good morning. Why is Pret A Manger, the high street chain, actually in need of a revival, do we think?
If you look at Pret's business model, obviously it relies a lot on consumers coming to work. They're nipping into Pret for their breakfast. Maybe they're popping out for some lunch and treating themselves to kind of a price point that's a little bit higher than what supermarkets offer. And clearly in the post-pandemic world, obviously fewer people are actually coming into work. Footfall on the high street has fallen a little bit for Pret. So that's one of the factors that it's facing. Obviously it's facing other things like higher taxes. We've got some of the highest energy costs in Europe, wages, and obviously the big question of business rates for tomorrow's budget. So Pret are kind of facing kind of a bit of a marriage of factors that they have to navigate, and their CEO is kind of trying to search for a right recipe for the chain in this kind of post-pandemic world. And yeah, as you mentioned, like some of those offerings of meal deals and salads might be the way to go.
Yeah, meal deals are more common in the supermarkets in the UK, aren't they? So what are the key elements then to this attempted revival plan?
So, yeah, as you mentioned, the meal deal is a kind of a supermarket staple here in the UK, and their CEO, Pano Christou, says that the British consumer loves a meal deal, which may well be the case. I certainly do. The kind of price point that they're trialling out in their stores for this meal deal, which will include a sandwich, drink and a snack, is kind of between £6 and £7. That is pricier than what most supermarkets offer, which kind of usually starts at about under £4. So that's going to be one of the things that they're hoping will kind of attract customers and lure them in. The other thing that you mentioned is these new salads. They call them super plates, which is quite a fun name, but they're they're kind of costing consumers as much as £12.95, which some people, and I spoke to customers, are saying that seems a little bit high. But yeah, as I say, they're trying to kind of lure kind of different kinds of customers in and yeah, offer a kind of broader range of products.
Oh, the meal deal. I mean, is that typically something only the UK does? I don't know. It's usually like, yes, as you say, sandwich, drink plus snack. What about the budget, though? Pret A Manger and other high street chains, I mean, we've been hearing a lot from businesses about how they're quite worried. Is Pret worried?
Pret is sort of very much at the, trying to persuade the Chancellor for tomorrow to not kind of dent very fragile consumer confidence at the moment. It's already said that after the last budget that they were having to restructure, after obviously national insurance contributions were raised, there was higher minimum wage, and that really hit the sector with kind of billions of extra annual costs. So they are very much, along with their kind of high street partners and other coffee chains, trying to say to the Chancellor, listen, this is not the time to try and, this is not the time to try and kind of hit back consumer confidence when it's already at a bit of a low. And actually further tax rises, and particularly that crucial business rates question, could kind of add to their pain further.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.